My mother spent 2 years humiliating my boyfriend at every family dinner because he drove an old truck and wore the same jacket. Then she found out who he actually was and suddenly wanted to be best friends. I met Nico at a laundromat. He was sitting on one of the folding tables reading a paperback, waiting for his clothes to dry. We started talking. He was calm, funny, didn't try too hard. He told me he worked in property management, drove an older Ford pickup with some rust along the bottom, wore plain clothes, nothing flashy, lived in a one-bedroom apartment about 10 minutes from mine. We went out that Friday and kept going out every week after. He always picked reasonable places. Diners, taco spots, the Thai place near the park. He never complained about money but never spent like he had any to burn. I liked that about him. I grew up watching my mother Renee obsess over what everything cost and who could afford what. She married my stepdad Phil when I was 11, mostly because he made good money as a regional sales director. She didn't hide it either. She told me once that love was nice, but security was better, and I should remember that when I started dating. So when I brought Nico home for Thanksgiving after 6 months together, the first thing my mother did was look at his truck through the window and ask me in the kitchen if he had a second job lined up. I told her he was fine and asked her to be normal. She wasn't. At dinner, she asked Nico what property management meant exactly. He said he handled buildings, maintenance, leasing. She asked how many buildings. He said a few. She looked at Phil and did this little smile that made me want to leave. After Nico left, she told me I was a pretty girl with a good job and could do much better than a handyman with a rusty truck. I told her he wasn't a handyman, and she said property management was just a polite way of saying the same thing. It got worse from there. Every single time Nico came to a family event, my mother found a way to make him feel small. At Christmas, she bought Phil an expensive watch and made a big show of it in front of everyone, then turned to Nico and said she wasn't sure what he'd like, so she got him a gift card. It was for $25. She handed it to him like she was doing charity work. Nico said thank you and put it in his pocket without blinking. At my birthday dinner in March, she asked him in front of the whole table if he'd thought about going back to school. Nico said he was happy where he was. She said being happy and being comfortable weren't the same thing, and that I deserved someone who could provide both. I told her to stop. She said she was just looking out for me. My sister Bridget was just as bad. She'd been dating a guy named Noel who worked in finance and never missed a chance to compare. She'd talk about the restaurants Noel took her to, the trips they were planning. Then she'd look at Nico and ask if we had any fun plans coming up. Nico would just say, yeah, we're good, and leave it at that. He never took the bait. I told Nico I was sorry about my family more times than I could count. He always told me it didn't bother him. Said people show you who they are and you just let them. I didn't fully understand what he meant until later. We'd been together almost 2 years when everything changed. Bridget was getting married and wanted the reception at a converted estate with gardens and a stone hall she'd seen online. She called my mother crying because the venue wanted $40,000 just for the booking and Noel's parents weren't helping. My mother called me ranting about how unfair it was that Bridget couldn't have her dream wedding. She asked if I could pitch in. I told her I made $38,000 a year and that wasn't happening. Then she paused and asked what about Nico. I asked what about him. She said maybe he could ask whoever owns the buildings he manages if they had any connections to event spaces. I told Nico about it that night, mostly as a joke. He got quiet for a second, then asked me the name of the venue. I told him. He nodded and said he knew the place. I asked how. He said because he owned it. I thought he was kidding. He wasn't. Nico pulled up a chair and told me everything. He didn't work in property management the way I'd assumed. He owned a commercial real estate company that held over 200 properties across 3 states. I never told my mother. I didn't need to. She found out on her own when Bridget toured the venue and the property manager mentioned the owner's name. Bridget called my mother. My mother called me. She was completely different. My phone started buzzing around 2 in the afternoon. By the time I checked, my mother had called me 17 times in 3 hours. The voicemails were all variations of the same panic. She wanted to know why I never mentioned Nico owned properties. She said she always knew he was special. She claimed she told Phil from the beginning that Nico had good qualities. My mother was rewriting 2 years of history in real time, and she expected me to go along with it. When I finally answered, she launched into questions about his company and how long I'd known. I thought about the $25 gift card at Christmas. I thought about her asking if he'd considered going back to the school. I thought about every single dinner where she made him feel small. The texts that followed were longer ones about how she'd always appreciated Nico's work ethic, how Phil had mentioned several times that Nico seemed smart and capable. Nico came over that evening and scrolled through the messages without saying anything. Then he said we needed to talk about what happens next. The way he said it made me realize this wasn't new for him. He told me about 3 serious relationships before me. Each one seemed perfect until they found out about the money. One asked him to buy her a car 2 days after finding out. Another started planning their wedding without him proposing. The third tried to get pregnant without telling him, figuring child support from his fortune would set her up for life. He'd learned to watch how people treated him when they thought he had nothing. My mother had failed that test spectacularly, but I'd passed it without knowing I was taking it. I'd loved him when I thought he managed a few apartment buildings and drove a beat-up Ford. 3 days later, my mother invited us to dinner. She opened the door before we even knocked, wearing a nice dress she usually saved for parties. She hugged Nico first, holding on longer than normal. The dining room table was set with the good china she only used for holidays. She gestured for Nico to sit in Phil's chair at the head of the table. Phil just smiled and said he didn't mind. She'd made pot roast with homemade rolls and the fancy butter from the expensive grocery store. She kept touching Nico's arm, telling him how she'd always appreciated his strong work ethic, how she could tell from the beginning he was going to do well. I watched Nico's face stay polite and neutral, but I could see the tightness around his eyes. Bridget showed up halfway through dinner claiming Noel was working late. She spent 10 minutes telling Nico how beautiful his venue was and how lucky she felt the space was available for her date. My mother jumped in to say how generous Nico was being. She'd already decided he was giving it to Bridget for free. In the kitchen, Bridget whispered, asking me to convince Nico to give her the venue for free or at least a huge discount. She said it's what family does and Nico could easily afford it. I said no. She called me selfish and said I was choosing a boyfriend over my own sister. That night, Nico told me everything about why he'd hidden his wealth. He'd built his company from nothing, starting with one rental property at 23. He needed to know I loved him for who he was. Watching my family treat him like garbage for 2 years actually proved I had the values he was looking for. I'd never asked him for money or suggested he should spend more or drive something nicer. 2 weeks later, my mother hosted a dinner party with her wealthy friend Melanie Stokes and Phil's business associate Lucas Branson. She introduced Nico as a successful commercial real estate developer and kept steering conversation toward his business. Melanie hung on every word. My mother beamed like she'd personally discovered his success. She was using him, showing him off like a prize she'd won. Then I saw her Instagram posts. Photos of Nico from the dinner party tagged with his company. The caption said how proud she was of her future son-in-law's success, how she'd always known he was going to do amazing things. She'd spent the week publicly claiming a relationship she'd spent 2 years undermining. Nico's business partner Pete called asking about the sudden social media attention and posts claiming Nico was engaged when he wasn't. I called my mother and told her to take the posts down. She said she was just proud and being supportive. Nico decided to offer Bridget a fair market discount of 15% on the venue, the same he'd give any family member of an employee, not the free venue she wanted. He said this wasn't about punishing Bridget, but about not rewarding conditional acceptance. My mother came over with cookies and launched into a speech about growing up poor, working double shifts, wanting better for her daughters. Then she steered it toward the venue discount and said maybe Nico could do more. I said no. She tried every approach, bringing up my graduation, driving 4 hours to pick me up when my car broke down in college Christmas mornings. Nico came over that night and said he was worried about us. He said his wealth would always make people act differently, and he needed a partner who could set boundaries. He said he'd watched 3 relationships fall apart because the women couldn't separate him from his bank account. He asked if I was strong enough to stand up to family pressure. That hurt, but I understood. He told me about his mother working 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, waiting tables during the day. They lived in a 1-bedroom apartment until he was 16. He bought his first rental property with construction savings. He still drove the old truck because it reminded him where he came from. His mother died 3 years ago and never got to see him successful. His values weren't just ideas, they were survival tools. I watched my mother at the grocery store one Saturday, talking to a neighborhood woman who taught at the elementary school. My mother's voice was polite but flat. She kept looking past the woman toward the parking lot. The conversation lasted 2 minutes before my mother walked away before the woman finished her sentence. This was who she was when nobody important was watching. This was how she treated people who couldn't do anything for her. The wedding came and Bridget pulled me aside at the venue to say she knew she'd been awful about the whole thing. She said demanding a free venue from Nico after how she'd treated him was wrong. At the reception, I watched people interact with Nico. Some asked genuine questions. Others, like Melanie, suddenly found him fascinating now that they knew about his money. The difference was obvious. Some people looked at him like a person. Others looked at him like an opportunity. 2 days after the wedding, my mother came over with a handwritten card. 3 pages about how she'd been thinking about priorities and values. She said she realized she'd taught me the wrong lessons about what mattered in a partner. She said watching me stand up to her made her reconsider things. She said she was sorry for how she'd treated Nico. It wasn't a complete transformation. She still made comments sometimes, but it was more self-awareness than I'd expected. 6 months after the revelation, Nico and I were stronger because we'd gone through this together. My relationship with my family was more honest but less close. I didn't go to every family dinner anymore. I set clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't tolerate. Nico and I started looking at houses together and talking about getting married. We found a place in a quiet neighborhood with good schools nearby. My mother asked to see pictures. She said it looked beautiful. She didn't mention the price or the neighborhood status. She just said she was happy for us. That felt like the biggest change of all.